part of a sort of agenda of saying this is where we are currently in terms of what we want to achieve. We think about our agenda in terms of 4 buckets, which are in terms of whether things can be prevented, treated, stopping relapse, or manage ongoing difficulties. And I guess one of our hypotheses is that we may need different interventions and therapies or treatments that are different for each of those different aims. And at the moment, we're not sure that the literature is so clearly divided into those foci. So one thing we're really interested in is trying to be really clear. Is this an intervention that helps prevent? Is it an intervention that helps treat when you've got problems? Does it stop things happening again once you're better? Or does it manage ongoing difficulties for those who have ongoing difficulties? And I think part of our contention here is that the field of mental health, and some of you will see that we announced yesterday a big study done by the International Alliance of Mental Health Research Fundings, looking at where funding was going on mental health research generally. And most of it is going into basic science, looking at biological and neuroscience underpinnings, which of course is very important work. But there's far less going into what helps prevent, treat, stop relapse, or manage ongoing. And one of the contentions of the priority area is that the field has been very focused on cause of difficulty, debates about what causes problems, with an assumption that if you can just work out what causes problems, you'll then find out how to treat them. Now, there may be some truth in that contention, but it's become like a sort of a fixed belief. And I suppose one of the things we're trying to do as funders is say, let's put that to one side for a moment, because those debates have led sometimes to quite sterile fights between social and biological constructions. Let's instead concentrate, regardless of cause, on what will prevent, treat, stop relapse, or manage ongoing, starting with an idea that maybe even if something's caused by one thing, it may be helped by another. So our focus is on anxiety and depression in young people, with a focus on 14 to 24-year-olds globally. And we take as our starting point that anxiety and depression are loose verbal descriptions of constellations of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that exist on a continuum and have been classified as entities by historical consensus. So as funders, we're very happy to work with people that take strict diagnostic categories. We're happy to work with people who feel very strongly there are no categories. What we do believe is there is a real set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that hold millions of people back each year, that link to feelings of hopelessness, of restlessness, of not being able to concentrate, and that's what we want to address, however they are defined. As Pim has said, we have a sort of ethical belief that in order to find this next generation of treatments and approaches, we really need to be helped by those who've got lived experience of anxiety and depression. So with our Kate Martin, our lived experience and public engagement lead, we've engaged a range of youth consultants. Josiah and Grace are 2 of the first, but we have another 12 being recruited at the moment. And they're there to help ensure and embed the voice of young people with lived experience of anxiety and depression globally, inform everything we do, so that we are not sort of creating things in labs that are not accessible to people or not what people want. So as I say, we launched our program in January of this year. And at that stage, we were talking about core components. We were interested in the core components, those aspects of any intervention, whether in healthcare or in self-care, that might really make a difference. And we were glossing it at that point as, the active ingredients of the intervention. And again, one of the starting points for our program is this idea that we want a level playing field between healthcare and self-care and indeed community care. So part of the, again, our analysis of the research to date is it's been very focused on what happens to people who access the clinic. But we know that's the minority of people with mental health problems globally, and even in high-income countries, that's a minority of people. So there are millions of people with mental health problems who never access the clinic, who find ways through both to prevent, treat, stop relapse, and manage ongoing difficulties. And we want to learn from them and what their solutions are, as much as we want to learn from what goes on in therapy sessions or via medication. And we want to understand, we want to disaggregate these ideas so that we can look at the common themes that may be relevant, whether in healthcare, self-care, or community care. So when we launched our commission, we thought about those active ingredients in terms of 4 different ways in: biological, behavioral, relationships, and societal. And for each of our 4 buckets, we shared sort of ideas we had from the literature of things that might be potential bets for what might constitute an active ingredient. So, for example, for prevention, we noted the literature says that good levels of physical activity, good nutrition, limited use of drugs or alcohol might all be prevention strategies. Whereas for stopping relapse, management of bodily states might be something that was very important. Similarly, if you look at relationships, structured, consistent, and positive interactions with significant others might be very important for prevention, and peer support and joining community engagement might be very important for managing ongoing difficulties. So there may be different things in each bucket, or they may be the same things. And what we did is we put out an open call to the community and asked researchers to suggest what were their best bets for one active ingredient. So we said we recognize from the start it's highly unlikely there's any one active ingredient out there that's going to make the difference. It's likely to be a combination, and it's likely to be different for different people in different contexts. But because the field had been so full of different people promoting quite complex interventions and evaluating those complex interventions as sort of unities, we wanted to explore, to disaggregate into their component parts in order to try and explore those active ingredients in more detail, and to do a review of the literature to really try and tease apart how they worked, who they worked for, and more importantly, perhaps who they didn't work for. So what we know and didn't know. So these were insight analyses. They were 3 months long, and we asked for teams to look at the existing literature, interview people if they wanted to in terms of stakeholder consultation, work with those with lived experience of the difficulties, and try and come up with some inferences about what they thought might be relevant. We also did a survey with just out to the general public to ask people about what did they think were their best bets for the active ingredients, and we just picked prevention and treatment as a way of keeping it manageable. And we found that from this very, I'm sure, skewed survey of 135 people, the 2 top bets were social connection for depression and economic and social security for anxiety in terms of prevention. And in terms of treatment, it was learning to deal with negative emotions and thoughts for depression and not avoiding feared experiences of things for anxiety, which seems to us not bad starting points and certainly consistent with much of the literature. We then put out, as I say, this call to researchers, and we ended up with 30 research teams and 26 proposed active ingredients. And I want to be clear here that we selected these 26 not on the basis of us deciding which were the most important, but based on the best applications the research teams gave us. So this is not to say these 26 are now the most important active ingredients. They were the ones that the research team suggested, that where they had the most sensible proposal about what they were going to do. And you can see that they were heavily weighted, that most of them focused on both anxiety and depression, and most of them focused on prevention of the problem and intervention as one thing. There were a few that were just for prevention, and there were a few that were for intervention only. And a lot of them were behavioral or cognitive or emotional. So increasing self-compassion, increasing sense of mattering, increasing social connection, for example. However, there were biological and societal ones, such as better sleep cots and body clocks, and increased neighborhood cohesion and cash transfers. So we ended up with a range of researchers from across the world, and we then brought them together once a month for the 3 months of the commission, and they then shared ideas and thinking and learning. And what I'm going to share with you is some of the learning we've got from that, and also some links to the reports that they've produced that are now available. So they've each produced short 2-minute videos and infographics around their core finding, and they're also going through the peer review process to have these published in peer review programs. Thing I wanted to emphasize is these did range from the cellular to the societal, and they range from the individual to the interpersonal. So there were 4 general learning points in terms of future research. The first is how hard it was to get detail from the reviews on age, context, and actually what interventions look like. There's very little research involving 14 to 24-year-olds as a focused group. And in fact, that was one of the big I think it surprised all the teams. This resulted in many of the commission teams having to extract findings from older age groups. There's incredibly limited evidence on different subgroups of what works for whom, when, and under what circumstances. And it was particularly hard to search by geographical context or culture or ethnicity or age group. Most studies were really poor on the detail of the implementation characteristics. So being clearer about exactly what was done so that it can be replicated. And there was a real lack of differentiation of whether the intervention was aimed at prevention, treatment, stopping relapse, and manage ongoing difficulties. There was a huge amount of jingle jangle. And for those who are not familiar, I'm about to tell you a term that you're going to use forever. The jingle jangle fallacy is the fact that some words are used where the same word is used to refer to two different concepts, or where two different words are used to refer to the same context. And the field of psychotherapy research is full of jingle jangle fallacies. So one of the things we really discovered early on that really surprised us is that some of the things that seemed very disparate as conceptually, say, for example, hopefulness and goal setting as two potential active ingredients, when you then actually look down into the detail of the measures being used to measure whether these things were happening, they were asking very similar questions. So it was almost like when you got down to it, it was two different words for the same concept. On the other hand, you would find across different papers, different people using completely different measures for the same concept. We also found unexpected links between seemingly diverse active ingredients. So the people studying reduced inflammation were finding lots of links with social connection being potentially a mechanism which reduced inflammation and so might actually be part of some similar process. There was some sense that the mechanism for the impact of cash transfers may in part be via the mechanism of affecting intimate partner violence. And it may be that, for example, some things needed to be sequential, that hopefulness may actually enhance your wish to go into nature, or it may be that going into nature increases your sense of hopefulness. So the issue of trying to tease out what's a mechanism, what's a moderator, what's an outcome, and what's a context, really complicated in this field. And I think that's something, again, that we felt the more people can come together and discuss these things, the more we can try and help clarify and come up with some sort of conceptual framework that we can work towards. One of the things that the groups that we brought together commented on was how rare it was, and I know you've done this in your groups, and I think it's something we need to do more in the science, to bring together people that were working on this core concept of active ingredients, but coming at it from completely different angles. They all said how they found the input from young people with lived experience very helpful, but they also found it helpful to collaborate in partnerships between each other and challenge and view each other. One of the comments one of the groups made was that there are a lot of perverse incentives for people not to collaborate or share ideas, because people make their careers based on, I make my field, this is my distinct area, and I've invented this new term, rather than saying, actually, we're using this term, let's try and find a commonality around how this is used, and let's try and agree common views of how these things might function. And then finally, and for me, I guess one of the key learnings from this so far is that process may be as important as what is chosen. So I think when we started on this journey, we thought very much of active ingredients as ingredients that you would pick, and then how you put them together was obviously important, but actually the act of choosing wasn't in our minds as an active ingredient. I've come out at this stage in the process thinking actually the act of choosing may itself be not just an active ingredient, but maybe one of the more important active ingredients. So flexibility, personalization, and agency may be as important as what the actual thing is that people do. Young people so far consulted talked a lot about the fact of finding it actually a revelation there might be more than two things they could choose from, the two things being talking therapies or medication. And some of the clinicians and researchers on the team were worried about the young people feeling overwhelmed by choice. What the young people said is, no, we're delighted by choice. We understand that it's complex out there. There's a lot of personal difference, and we want to be guided to make choices that are right for us. We don't need that to be broken down to just one choice. The other thing is that when they thought about how they chose their active ingredients, young people were using different criteria from the ones sometimes that the researchers anticipated they might use. So, for example, they were more concerned as whether it was accessible, and also how like them the people who spoke about them, who said they'd found it helpful, were. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that as we go on. So just to share with you just 4 examples of the sort of findings from the reviews. So Alan Bailey and team in Australia looked at bodily movement. They found from their review of the evidence that for depression, certainly, for young people already experiencing depression, physical activity seems to help reduce symptoms. The evidence is much less clear for anxiety. There's no support for a minimum dose. Most important, again, is this idea of preference. How much they do and the context they do it in all need to be chosen by the young people. And that there may be more impact for those who were initially inactive than those who were already active, where there may be ceiling effects. At the other end of the scale, from the biological to the societal, increased financial resources via cash transfers was a review undertaken by Johannes Haushofer and colleagues. And there they found a consistent, a very small but absolutely consistent effect of economic transfers improving youth mental health. And unconditional cash transfers seem to be more effective than when they were made conditional in some way. And interestingly, Johannes has just published a research finding looking to a randomized control trial where they compared cash transfers alone with cash transfers with psychotherapy alone, looking at a very broad brush measure of depression in Kenya. And they found the cash transfers alone were as effective as the psychotherapy and cash transfers, and more effective than the psychotherapy alone. So there was no helpful impact of the psychotherapy added to it. So there may be something about cash, certainly in low resource context, that is really important. Behavioral activation was looked at by Kanika Malik and colleagues, who found that that many mental health interventions include behavioral activation as one of their elements, but that actually there's quite a lot of difference in how people consider it and how it's defined, and a real lack of clarity about what it actually involves in different interventions. There's a lot of evidence for it being effective in relation to depression, again, less than anxiety. There seems to be some evidence that it may work better in a group format. And again, there was some interesting thinking about, is behavioral activation happening naturally in people's lives that we're not capturing? And how do we see that? How do we capture that and do appropriate rigorous science when it's outside of a healthcare setting? And finally, just an example at the societal level and at the sort of interpersonal level is better urban access to green spaces that Issy Bray and colleagues looked at, where they found that there's strong evidence that walking or being in a green space like a forest or a park, and it's sometimes called forest bathing, can improve mood and reduce feelings of anxiety in young people. And then they hypothesized about the mechanisms for that, whether it's time away from noise or whether it's about inducing a sense of mindfulness. They also talked about the fact that it could be even short, so even a 15-minute walk could make a difference, but the longer the better, and that excursions to natural environments outside the city may have particular psychological benefits. So those are just some examples, but if you go to the, just seeing if I've got it, yeah, I've got later on, I think I've got a link to the where you can find some of the more information about the wider range. So coming out of this, we're starting then to think, okay, how do we think about best bets? How do we actually try and now come to a conclusion about where we should focus our energies? And as I've discussed, the interrelationships are complicated. You know, the image that now comes to my mind is Escher's endless staircase. You know, is hopefulness a mechanism, an outcome, or is it a context? Is going out to a green space an outcome, a context, or a mechanism? And the more you peel the onion, the harder it is to get at what's core. One of our the people that we commissioned originally is now working with us, along with a colleague, Usman Hamandi, to look at where the gaps are and also to try and see, can we build together a conceptual framework that brings together these different elements, and what would that look like? We're also drawing together views from across the world around what they think is missing from the current list, what they think are the most promising, and what they think are the least promising. From the 272 people that undertook our survey in July, and again, it's skewed, I'm sure, in many ways, the things that they thought were the most promising ingredients from the existing list were improved view of self, improving social relationships, and developing helpful thinking patterns. Their view of the least promising ingredients, the ones they'd vote off, would be use of antidepressants, better gut microbiome function, and engagement with the theatre and the arts. They also gave a lot of qualitative views of what might be missing, ranging from addressing discrimination and marginalization, such as racism or homophobia, supporting sexual identity development, addressing abuse or bullying, giving a sense of agency, fostering a sense of purpose, parent or family interventions, interventions aimed at school and work contexts, and interventions aimed at reducing social inequality and increased social justice. We'll be doing a second commission in February of next year, where we'll be looking to plug some of these gaps, but also trying to see if there are ways to weave together how the active ingredients work and what conceptual frameworks might be put together. One idea that we are considering at the moment, and I'd be really interested in people's views on this, is whether we take a portfolio approach. So again, we came into this thinking maybe 3 or 4 will absolutely emerge that are the key things that we should look at. We have not seen that happening. We're wondering whether, as funders and as a research community, we mean take an approach where we divide it a bit like an investment portfolio, where we say there are some interventions where we really know there's quite a lot of evidence they work. They're not going to solve everything, but there's enough evidence to say we should really be looking at how we implement them, how we scale them up, how we embed them. That might include exposure, it might include relaxation, it might include sleep, it might include behavioral activation. Then there might be others that are more emergent, which are generating some excitement in the field, but have not been studied enough or are not yet evidence-based enough, and may prove to be dead ends, but it may be worth taking a punt, such as inflammation or diet. And then there may be others that I'm thinking of more like sort of a bond market, where there's evidence that they'd like to make some effect, but it's small amounts, but for large populations. So investing in them at a sort of policy level may provide slow yields, but over many years. So for example, elements around social cohesion at societal levels, or addressing social inequity, or tax systems may be things that we want to think about as topics for scientific funding. And then this issue around agency and choice, I think, is going to be one that we need to think about how we build into our research designs. How do young people choose currently, and how can we support them to choose? And one of the things, again, I think has been a change in my own mindset on this is, as a professor of evidence-based practice, I was trained to think people in the lay public don't understand about evidence. We need to train them in the evidence. We need to train them to make choices that are more effective. We need to tell them which are the evidence-based treatments. And for many years as a professor of evidence-based practice, I'd be saying, don't do anything that comes to your mind, only do from this limited list of evidence-based treatments. As I started looking into the research to see how limited the evidence was for so many of the evidence-based treatments, and how little we knew about so many other things that people were naturally doing, I have shifted in perspective on this, and I'd be really interested in Pim and others' views. And I've come to wonder whether perhaps the young people are better scientists than some of the scientists, or certainly than I as a scientist have been, in the sense that they understand that mean differences between groups mean nothing for them as an individual. They need to think about who is like them in which characteristics, and they might want to choose, at least to start, in terms of thinking about, can I choose that thing first and see how it works? I know there's work by Ron Kester and others that say it can take visiting up to 9 therapists to find one that fits for you, and often it's the 5th one or so. But maybe that isn't just an artifact of us being sort of stupid in some way. Maybe it's about the fact that people have to open many doors before they find the right ingredients or the right recipes that are right for them. And maybe that's about helping people go on that personalized journey. And that's where we should be thinking about. So one of the things we are starting to play with as a metaphor, and I'm really interested in people's views, and I put in the chat a link to a poll around this, is this idea of thinking about active ingredients as cookery, as a form of cookery, a form of chemistry that we all do, and that can be done in professional kitchens when you go out to eat at a restaurant, or in home kitchens. So we've been working with through our cultural engagement team with a wonderful company called Flying Object, who've been trying to do visual representations of what active ingredients might look like if we think about them as ingredients in your store cupboard. So, you know, they might be a mix of positive activity, sense of mattering, addressing repetitive negative thinking, reducing loneliness. And each of our store cupboards might be different depending on our own circumstances or our own context. These might be some of the active ingredients in our mental health store cupboard. And they will change by location. So this, for example, is it visualized for a Rwandan audience, since this is a product that's used in Rwanda. And they may range from sort of classic ways of treating mental illness that seem to be more on the sort of medical store cupboard, through to ingredients that affect how we think about things, or activities or practices we take up, or things that can only be done at a societal level by governments, or things that other people need to be involved in if we're going to find ways forward. And again, it might help us think about the fact that most people have favorite foods for whatever reason. In the same way, different people may have different ingredients that are effective for them, and indeed they may be effective for them at different times. What works for them at one part of their life may be different from what works for them at another part of their life. And some may be things that just help and amplify other things, and some may be able to work entirely by themselves. And I think one of the other things we need to be thinking about as researchers is always thinking about what the unintended harms are. So particularly in psychological therapies, I think we've had a sort of warm assumption on the whole that that more is better and that they can do no harm. And I think we always need to be thinking about the potential harms that any of these ingredients can do, either because of too much or because they don't work for that person. We need to be thinking about new active ingredients, but also possibly new combinations of old active ingredients, and being aware that recipes can come both from professional experts, but also from wider communities and friends that we may need to, but we need to investigate them all with the same level of rigor and science. So as I've said, it may be context dependent and persons dependent. And key may be that people are given choices and help to make choices that are right for them. And this is a quote from Grace Gutera, our lived experience advisor, on why she thinks this approach may be helpful. So I'm going to close with just some very early thoughts from me around what agency and choice might look like, and then I'll hand over to questions. So in my previous role, before I joined the Wellcome, I worked for a charity called the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families. And because of the work I was doing as an academic, we came to think about the fact there were all these different things that people were doing outside of healthcare that had never been studied. So we created this website called On My Mind, which lists all those things that we found in the literature that had been suggested as things that might help address anxiety and depression, but hadn't been fully looked at in terms of scientific study, to allow people to start to look at them and to try them and to try and encourage researchers to research them. More recently, I've also come across a very interesting project called NEON, which is run by Mike Slade and colleagues at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And there, what they're doing is they are curating lists of recovery stories of people who have experienced severe and enduring illness, but also depression and anxiety and a range of mental health problems. And then they're doing randomized trials to see if other people accessing those recovery stories helps their own recovery, if they start to resonate with people in ways that can help them think through opportunities for recovery that may make sense for them. And interestingly, they have developed taxonomies of those recovery stories that range from things that were to do with working within the system to things that were done in terms of more self-care, to things that were done to models of enduring problems, to models of enlightenment, to models of escape. There's a whole range of taxonomies around how people think about recovery that I think we're just at the start of. So what I can see is missing here, and I will put in the chat when I find it, is the link to the Mental Health, which is a social media blog that has the link to the findings from the commission that we did that I talked about. So I'll put that in the chat. But at this point, I'll stop speaking and hand over to questions. Thank you. Pim, I don't know whether you're there. I can't hear anyone, but I don't know whether I've got lost. I'll turn off my camera and sound so in case that is what's stopping other people. It looks like there's a problem, in which...
Yeah, I hope it works now. Can you hear me, Miranda?
Yeah, I can now. Great.
Sorry about that. There was a problem with the microphone. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I want to ask everybody to give questions in the chat function. I don't know if you've seen that. I see one question, the first one, but first of all, Miranda, I think this is a very nice overview of what has been done at the Wellcome Trust and the first steps you have taken in the mental health priority area. I like the very diverse way of looking at active ingredients and a very broad view, the patient involvement. I thought that was a great talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to ask everybody to give questions now in the chat function. You can find that on your screen. I hope you can all find it and pose a lot of questions. Maybe I can ask one myself to start with while I'll go through the other questions, Miranda. Maybe you can then extend a bit on what the goal is of identifying active ingredients. So why do you do that? Do you want simpler interventions? Do you want to make them easier, better accessible? Do you want to make them more effective? So maybe you can say something about why do we want to know about active ingredients?
Thank you. That's a great question. And the answer is yes, we want all of those things. We want more scalable interventions. We want to have more effective interventions. We want to have greater understanding of more personalized interventions. So for all those reasons, we think it's important to disaggregate before we aggregate up again. And I guess it relates back to a hypothesis we have about where we are currently, which is that the field has built all these different, quite complicated interventions and then is treating them as monoliths. It's as if we've got all these different buildings that are then competing for everyone's attention, which can be quite expensive and complicated to do. And what we're saying is, can we look at the building blocks? We might need to put those building blocks together in different formations in order to have best impact in the world. So it's not that we think we're going to find one active ingredient that's going to rule them all and all the others will be unnecessary. No one will ever just want to eat just one food, as you were saying earlier, Pim. It is a question of trying to, but on the other hand, if we only buy very expensive recipe books that say the only thing you can do is create this very expensive recipe, we may be missing out on opportunities for things that could really have impact globally.
Well, thank you very much. That's indeed, these are very good points. I try to select a few of the questions I see, and I'm sorry if it doesn't work to give them all to you, Miranda. But Here is Bianca Albers, who has one interesting question. She says, Miranda, I sense that you have a pragmatic take on what exactly an active ingredient is. As if you're saying, at the end, it doesn't matter so much whether something is a mechanism, an outcome, or a contextual factor. The important thing is to find the right combination of active ingredients that work for an individual. Is that a fair interpretation?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. I think in the long term, it will be really good to be able to work out the difference between something being a mechanism, an outcome, or a contextual factor. But I think at this moment, it would not be true to say we know those differences. And I think artificially putting things into different categories may actually stop us thinking in new ways. So in that sense, yes, Bianca, I think it is important that we are pragmatic and try and think about them in whatever ways make sense for the particular research design. So for one person, one researcher or one individual, it might be a contextual factor. For another person, it might be the mechanism. So I think it is trying to find the units, the active ingredients, trying to find them at the level that can be most usefully researched and implemented on the ground.
Thank you. Another question from Martina Jeukens. Have you tried to already link ingredients to certain groups that may benefit from it?
That's a great question. I think one of the things we learned from the literature reviews is how little subgroup analysis there is. So I think we really need to think about, as a research community, which are the groups we want to prioritize in terms of thinking about what the groupings are. Do we think in terms of ethnicity? Do we think in terms of gender? Do we think in terms of geographical location? Do we think in terms of age? All of these things are important. Which groupings are the ones that we want to, do we hypothesize are going to have the most differences that we need to think through? So one of the things we're doing within the Wellcome Trust is we've just commissioned a global mental health data bank where we're working in South Africa and in India and in the UK just for feasibility for the first year and a half. And the idea of that is diverse groups of young people will collect information about their lives that gives information about which active ingredients are working for them in which context. And that might give us some insights into the different ways different groups are differentially impacted or differentially work with different active ingredients. But I think we need to scale up the research for large population groups in order to really look at subgroups in meaningful ways. And we have the opportunity now with the spread of digital availability across the globe, we have the opportunity to do research at scale as never before. And that scale is going to be what's going to transform how we understand and think about and treat anxiety and depression.
Thank you. I have another question from Jane Lewis. She says, great presentation, Miranda. Totally agree. She's one of the teams luckily enough to be part of the program. She totally agrees that there was very little evidence on implementation. What aspects of implementation did you see as particularly lacking across the areas? And is this an area Wellcome will be taking forward?
Absolutely, and great to have you here virtually, Jane. I think we were all shocked just how little detail there was about anything about what people were doing. And I know there's a group, I think, talking today, I'm hoping to join the breakout session about taxonomies of interventions. And I think we really need to think about how we help publishers and others require the level of detail we need so that we can go back and understand what people actually did. So I think in terms of we have been slow as a community to find best ways to describe, you have statements like, oh, they were given CBT or they had 6 sessions of CBT, but what did that actually mean? It's the jingle jangle again. What did that actually involve? And how can we then know, how can we tease apart what was involved there in terms of understanding what impact it had? So I think we're starting from a very low base, and absolutely Wellcome wants to work with anyone who's interested in this. And I'm very open to ideas around how we can embed this into general research practice. So any ideas people have got, please let me know.
Thanks. Roxanne has a question. Is there a core focus now on collecting research for 14 to 24 years old? What will this look like, and how and what will this look like?
So we've chosen 14 to 24-year-olds not because we think they're the most important group or the only group, and there's no magic about 14, there's no magic about 24. The reason we chose that is we felt that we wanted to look, because we know that most mental health problems start before the ages of 24, and many, in fact, before 14. We wanted to look at that sort of initial period particularly. They're quite an overlooked group often. So there's quite a lot of research on the younger age range, and there's quite a lot of research on working age adults. So we picked it deliberately and slightly provocatively because we knew that it wasn't underlooked at group. But we don't want this to be reified as this is the most important group, this is the only group. It's where we focus for this priority area. Just to be aware that Wellcome as a charity is now taking on mental health in a broader capacity, so there will be other work outside this age range and outside anxiety and depression. In a way, we wanted to pick a lens, and this was the lens we've chosen.
Thanks. Joel Coe also has a question. Does limiting our understanding of active ingredients jar innovation and new interventions?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think the key issue here is to keep open-minded. So I think the whole concept of best bets, we need to think about as best bets for the moment, but we need to have new bets coming on, new ideas coming up, new ingredients being sourced. So if someone discovers a new plant that might become a fantastic foodstuff, when I was growing up, who knew hummus would be a staple foodstuff for most people's fridges? It was, even different sorts of pasta were new to us. So, there will be new ingredients that come on. And I think that's why we need to keep a portfolio approach. I think one of the problems of evidence-based medicine has been sometimes you're on the list, and once you're on the list, you don't get off the list, and it's hard to get on the list. So it's trying to keep open-minded to both what are known helpful active ingredients and what might be new ones coming forward.
Thanks. Catherine Mugalian asks, is there a specific reason you're focusing on anxiety and depression?
Again, it's a bit like the answer to 14 to 24-year-olds. It's not because we think they're the only problems in the world or the most important problems, but they are very big global problems. They're the most common mental health disorders. And also, I think from the point of view of the Wellcome Trust trying to help galvanize mental health science and a sort of bring together mental health science, they're interesting because they conceptually, this sort of ideas bleed into what's normal or not normal in ways that other areas of mental health are more specialist and more clear cut. So they raise issues around where do we see the boundaries between problems and normal reactions to life? How do we address them at scale? How are we going to address something that really affects so many people at so many parts of their life? So it was chosen as a lens by which we could work through some of these issues, but Wellcome is also interested in other areas of mental health, from psychosis to neurodevelopmental. So I wouldn't want you to think we were saying these are the only important things.
Thanks. Professor Orobia de Castro asks, Dear Miranda, thanks for a wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, people may be depressed for very different reasons. So would it perhaps be more useful to consider which effective ingredients help for which maintaining factors of diverse problems than for which outcomes? So for example, cash transfers may help both depression and addiction for people who struggle with poverty, but not for people who are filthy rich.
I think that's a great question. I think we want to stay relentlessly focused on outcomes and on active ingredients for outcomes rather than addressing cause, because we don't want to get pulled back into a debate about cause. Now, that still your statement can fit within an outcome framework. It may be this outcome is less effective. If you already got a lot of money and someone gives you more money, it may be a less effective treatment for you than for someone who has no money. But that's not to say the cause is to do with the money. It's to do with what it affects in terms of your outcome. So I suppose I want to push back a bit on still wanting to focus on outcomes and solutions and future rather than what caused the problem, and any moral judgment around whether the cause was biological, social or otherwise. It's really about what helps that person move on in life and not be held back. So, I mean, just to give the example of the money, for example, it could be, if the mechanism by which cash transfers works is the mechanism by which people feel valued or cared about, it could be that it has the same effect for someone who has all the money in the world as it does for someone who has no money. I'm not hypothesizing that is the mechanism, and I think it's unlikely that is the case. But but I think that's something that would need to be empirically tested.
Thanks. Ron Scholte asks, Dear Miranda, wonderful presentation. The question I'm struggling with is it just about the ingredients or also about the order in which the ingredients are offered?
Again, great question. And I think that's where we're moving to. So I suspect it's not just about the ingredients, it's about the order, the amount, the sequencing, who gives the ingredients, how accessible those ingredients are, how palatable those ingredients are. I mean, in a way, I think this is why I am quite keen on this metaphor, because I think it's generative of the range of complexity that we're going to have to deal with. And I know that Pim's going to address in his remarks later on in relation to how do we design research that addresses that complexity without recreating these very complex evaluations that you can't then tease apart. How do we combine simplicity with complexity is, I guess, part of the challenge for us as a field. How do we try and pull out these component parts and these attributes without thinking that they are sort of independent entities? And I guess I draw increasingly on the models of sort of complex science and complexity theory to say, there is no simple way of doing this. They will be altered, those ingredients will be altered by what they're used with and in what context they're used. And we have to acknowledge that, but it doesn't mean there isn't some helpfulness in trying to pull out and simplify and then try and find other ways to then review how they mix together in complex ways.
Thanks. Good answers all the time. So for the audience, there are still a few minutes. So now you have an opportunity to ask Miranda some more questions. Miranda, before ending, I have a question also of myself. You said that collaboration between researchers can be a problem, that people often don't collaborate with each other. And that's stimulated by the system. Is that something you want to do something about, or do you see
it is, and I wouldn't want to say people don't collaborate. I think people collaborate all the time, and they collaborate very effectively, but they tend to collaborate in groups that then think quite like each other. And I suppose it's trying to think, how can we find collaborations that cut across existing groupings? And what's the shape of those? And again, I'm really open to any ideas people have about that. We're thinking about ideas of whether it will be helpful to bring new roles into the field of mental health science whose only job is not to do, they wouldn't do primary research themselves, but their job is to act as like a pollinator between the different groups, like a communicator between them, to bring messages to each other from, did you know this group's doing this interesting, it may be interesting to you. So one of the things I learned from bringing the groups together in this process, and it'd be interesting if Jane felt the same, often things would come up in conversation that never made its way into their written reports or into what's now come out in the public domain. And it's those bits that we've got to find ways to capture as a research community and share with each other. In the world of coding and in digital world, they use GitHub, where they sort of put ideas down and everyone can share them. We've got to find a GitHub for the psychological sciences.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we only have 1.5 minutes left in this session, so I don't think there is more time to answer more questions. Maybe we can come back to them later, because we're going into a break now. And after the break, there will be at 11:10, there will be the start of the first series of 3 sessions. And then there are 2 more series of 3 sub-sessions, including a lunch break. And we will be back together in this plenary meeting at 2:35. and I wish you all the best with these sub-sessions. I hope you learn a lot and learn to meet a lot of other colleagues. And I'll see you soon in the last plenary session. And Miranda, once again, thank you so much for this visionary talk and about the inspiring work you're doing at the Wellcome Trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to the organisers for a great conference. Thank you.
Hello, Miranda. Can you hear me? Ja, dat is misschien ook een goeie.
Hi.
Yes, hello, Miranda.
I can see you. I'm going off, but I just wanted to say thank you, and thanks, Pim.
Hearing you.
Oh.
Maybe what my microphone was.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Try to put it on the speaker so Pim can hear you too. That was a good presentation.
Thank you. I hope that was. I'm curious whether Pim's more critical now, having heard it.
No, I think it was amazing. Very good.
Oh, good. That's. Well, thank you, and I thought the questions were great. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I think it was really. I think the recipe, the kitchen thing, is really very convincing.
It's fun. You can. It can start to. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But we'll play with it for a bit.
I won't forget easily the jingle jangle fallacy.
The jingle jangle once you know it, and it's so true for everything we're doing.
We're gonna use it in the social media too.
Yeah, no, do. I'll try. I must put in a hashtag actually for the present. Are you doing social media? I must make sure I'm retweeting. I'll go to that now.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll do the poll again. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and join one of the sessions after this break. Unfortunately,